Good afternoon. As Chairman of the Senate Commerce Subcommittee on Manufacturing, Trade, and Consumer Protection, I welcome you all here today to a hearing entitled Protecting Americans from COVID-19 Scams. The nation continues to fight the unprecedented public health crisis brought on by COVID-19 pandemic. In addition to the serious threat this pandemic poses to the health of Americans, the economic impact of the shuttered Main Street businesses, resulting from responsible public health protocols, have been felt in every corner of the country. It has become clear that preventive practices, policies, and dedicated resources, including expanding testing capabilities and the availability of personal protection equipment, are absolute necessities to a responsible path forward to reopening the economy and extinguishing this health crisis. However, during this time of national emergency and coordinated recovery, there are fraudsters and scam artists that seek to take advantage of consumers, especially the nation's most vulnerable communities like that of our nation's seniors. In fact, the FTC's Consumer Sentinel Network reports that consumers across the U.S. have reported over 136,000 different cases of COVID-related scams, totaling approximately $90 million in total fraud losses from January 1 to July 20, 2020. More specifically, at home in Kansas, over this same period of time, consumers report over 500 related cases totaling over $800,000 in financial losses. Everyone should also bear in mind that these are only the reported cases, and that it is fair to assume that there are a number of harmful consumer scams that have not been reported to date. The variety of these increasingly complex and innovative scams remains exceedingly difficult for any consumer to wrap their head around, much less defend themselves against. Whether it be unsubstantiated health benefits advertised for certain products, illegal robocalls pitching low-priced health insurance, fraudulent donation solicitations, or even imposters claiming to be from federal agencies collecting mandatory payments, raising awareness to these harmful practices is critical to educating consumers and protecting themselves. As such, this subcommittee has much to learn from law enforcement agencies, industry, and consumer protection experts in their efforts to not only identify and address these harms, but also what exactly they are doing to prevent these harms from occurring in the first place. Additionally, if there is a role for Congress to play in supporting these efforts, those suggestions we will need today and in the future. More specifically, I look forward to hearing from the Federal Trade Commission on how their current U.S. Safe Web authorities are utilized in addressing COVID-related scams stemming from abroad, and how enactment of the U.S. Safe Web Extension Act, which I introduced with the ranking member, Senator Blumenthal, is critical for continuing these foreign law enforcement coordination efforts. Additionally, I would be interested to hear from the witnesses about any specific efforts directed to particularly vulnerable groups of Americans like our seniors. My colleague, Senator Klobuchar, joined me in introducing Protecting Seniors from Emergency Scam Act, which directs the FTC to report to Congress on scams targeting seniors during this pandemic, makes recommendations on how to prevent future scams during emergencies, and appropriately to distribute such information to seniors and their caregivers. Finally, the subcommittee looks forward to hearing more about current enforcement efforts to detect, identify, and prosecute criminal organizations engaged in these illegal activities. If there are ways Congress can assist to strengthen the current framework of government task forces, joint initiatives with state and local agencies, and partnerships with the private sector to address the crimes, this subcommittee would again welcome the suggestions. Today's witness panel provides a variety of different perspectives on the same important issue. Joining the subcommittee is the Honorable Derek Schmidt, the Attorney General of the state of Kansas, Mr. Andrew Smith, Director of the FTC's Bureau of Consumer Protection, Mr. Stu Showerman, Founder and CEO of KnowBe4's, Inc., and Ms. Laura McCleary, Policy Director for the Center of Science in the Public Interest. While the Food and Drug Administration was not able to join us today, the agency has been active in protecting consumers throughout this pandemic and provided written testimony for the subcommittee's consideration and agreed to respond to questions for the record from the committee members as well. Finally, U.S. Telecom provided a letter for the record describing the collaborative efforts of companies in the industry traceback group to actively trace and identify sources of illegal robocalls that have only increased in frequency during the pandemic. I ask that this letter be submitted for the record. Without objection, it is. With that, I now turn to the ranking member, Senator Blumenthal, for his opening statement.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing. In the wake of almost every disaster in this country, no matter how dire, there are always bottom feeders and con artists who exploit people's fears and hopes. We all know, probably everybody watching and listening today knows, there is no cure for COVID-19. And there is no vaccine or other medical prevention. That has not stopped the con artists and scams from exploiting people's fears and hopes. In fact, they have defied both science and common decency in taking advantage of people financially. So the scams range from invasion of privacy and products that are useless, price gouging, mortgage and student loan relief scams, false cures and fake tests, cons. But more than just financial loss, people face real healthcare danger. False cures can kill. False cures not only take people's money, they can kill. And deception can be deadly. So there are a variety of products, and in fact, the FTC has issued 255 warning letters. Those 255 companies were defrauding and endangering consumers before they were caught. Those 255 companies are among hundreds of others that are still doing business. Those 255 companies have paid no cost, none, for breaking the law and harming people, despite the FTC's warning letters. And they are still doing business. They may have changed their marketing pitches to be slightly less deceptive and misleading, but they're still out there. And if warning letters will not protect consumers, we need stronger action. On March 9th, I wrote to the FTC and the FDA calling on both agencies to take more aggressive action to stop the marketing and sale of fake coronavirus cures. Warning letters to marketers simply fail to give consumers fair notice. They fail to inform. They fail to correct wrong information. And they send no real signal to the market. There needs to be real deterrence, not just warning letters, a slap on the wrist. I'm also alarmed that, again, we see high-tech firms enabling consumer harm through negligence and inaction. Last month, I wrote the FTC and the FDA on the dozens of unsafe supplements being sold on Amazon and other online marketplaces that claim to kill viruses. Amazon still has supplements, tonics, probiotics in a search for the COVID cure. We need to stop the snake oil salesmen. I mentioned a number of them in my March 9th letter. In particular, TV evangelist Jim Baker, who recently promoted a celluloid silver on his show, claiming that it would eliminate viruses, such as coronavirus. Another one, cellular silver itself claims to, quote, achieve 99.99% complete kill against 660 microorganisms. Again, this is deception. We find these kinds of utterly false ads for quiescence, aromatherapy, energetics, Guru Nanda, Vivify Holistic Clinic, Herbal Amy. There is a list, and it is growing. So many of us, I think, hope that this crisis would pass swiftly and that we could return to a normal life, both the healthcare crisis and the economic crisis. We're 6 months into this pandemic. There's no end in sight. to this horrendous national suffering. We've seen hardship and heartbreak. It has been aggravated, not reduced, by many of these false and misleading promises for products that threaten health care, endanger lives, take money from people unfairly and illegally, but also pose grave dangers to public health. And if we can do something about them, Mr. Chairman, we will accomplish a lot of good for the American people. Thank you.
Senator Blumenthal, thank you. We now will hear testimony from our witnesses, and we will begin with the Honorable Derek Schmidt, Attorney General, State of Kansas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Moran, thank you for the invitation, and thank you for accommodating our remote testimony today. I'll admit it's the first time I've presented congressional testimony without leaving the office of the Attorney General in Topeka, so we hope it lives up to your needs. Mr. Chairman, you have, both you and the ranking member have laid out, I think, very well the framework in which we operate as a state-level enforcement agency. You have my written testimony, and I certainly won't read it. I thought I would use my minutes here for oral presentation to just emphasize a few of the highlights that we've already presented to you in writing. Let me first discuss one case for the purpose of illustrating, not because that case is necessarily all that extraordinary, but it illustrates some of the types of enforcement actions that at the state level we are engaged in. I had already filed a lawsuit prior to the COVID pandemic against a defendant, a fellow named Sean Parcells. I actually have both criminal and civil litigation pending against him and his related companies, so I'm obligated at this point to say that criminal charges, of course, are only accusations, and a defendant is presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty. But on the civil side for the enforcement action, we had accused Mr. Parcells of violating our state's consumer laws by selling autopsy services, tissue recovery services, and other related types of services without having the qualifications to do so. We had him enjoined from operating within the state of Kansas, enjoined by court order during the pendency of our litigation. And then along came COVID. And we received information after the pandemic erupted into the public consciousness that our enjoined defendant had set up some new companies and was peddling essentially the same services, although in a new package outside of Kansas, beyond where he was enjoined. And specifically, he was marketing his unqualified services to families and individuals who were had loved ones who were deceased as a result of COVID to do autopsy and tissue recoveries, for which we've accused he is entirely unqualified. We were able to, because we had the case already pending, the investigation for the additional information didn't take terribly long. We were able to go back in front of our judge and receive an expanded temporary restraining order that prevents him from representing himself on any of this, including on the COVID-related services, and also bars him from leaving the state of Kansas without case-by-case permission from our court. I use this case just to illustrate, we often talk at the broad policy level about sort of the collective impact of cases and behaviors by groups of defendants, groups of companies, whatever it may be, and those are certainly important. But at the end of the day, enforcement actions, at least at the state level, typically boil down to one defendant or an associated group of defendants, one group of victims, and one group of misconduct. And so those are the types of cases we wind up dealing with some regularity. Moving beyond that individual case, let me just mention some of the types of complaints of scams and related misconduct we've been receiving since the pandemic erupted onto the stage in March. We have investigations pending with respect to each of these categories. I won't be able to discuss the particular investigations, but I can certainly talk about the general approach and subject matter. And let me say, as both you, Mr. Chairman, and the ranking member have already pointed out, the crooks and scam artists use the same tools they always use in terms of trying to get into people's pocketbooks. They just change the messaging to reflect the current concerns about COVID and to prey upon what people are currently worried about. So we saw, for example, the first wave that we saw come in that continues were text message scams related to contact tracing, something that back in March most Americans had never heard of. And the text messages would come in and claim along the lines of, this is an official communication letting you know that you've been in contact with a person who has tested positive for COVID-19. Please click on this link in order to get more public health information to help you know what you need to do next. Of course, it was a phishing email. Clicking on the link resulted in an invitation to provide personal information that had nothing to do with any legitimate public health purpose. We put out an early consumer alert in our state on that to raise awareness and try to help people avoid the problem, because it's obviously much easier to prevent people from becoming a victim than it is to chase down their money once it's gone, particularly when the scammers operate outside of our jurisdiction and often from offshore. Another type of scam that we've seen a lot of complaints on, as already mentioned by Senator Blumenthal, are COVID prevention and treatment scams. It's everything you've read about, but they come in all the usual ways, sometimes by robocall, sometimes by personal call, sometimes by text message, sometimes by email. We've seen PPE scams, claims to be able to sell PPE to folks, and then either there wasn't any PPE or it existed, but it was subpar, or it existed and it was good, but it was stolen. It wasn't theirs to sell. We've seen all of the above. We've seen scams related to stimulus checks, often a government imposter type of scam, communications saying to folks, we're from the Small Business Administration, we're from the IRS, we're from a fill-in-the-blank government agency, and we're here to assist you in making sure you get the payment to which you're entitled. And we've seen fraudulent unemployment claims. Usually the objective there is to get personal information and get a payment based on some type of identity theft. Finally, Mr. Chairman, I might just say, from our standpoint, the ability to cooperate with federal agencies is really critical. The vast majority of law enforcement in this country, especially on scams and frauds, is conducted at the state and local level. But we are geographically and jurisdictionally limited. And it makes no sense for us to be doing our thing in the territory that is Kansas and the federal agencies to be doing their thing within the territory that is Kansas, and us not to be coordinating. So we always coordinate very closely, particularly with our regional agency offices, usually out of Kansas City. We have very good working relationships with the principal agencies you'd expect for this type of work, whether it's HHS, OIG, or the FBI or the Secret Service, among others. And we have redoubled those efforts during COVID. Two things I might suggest for consideration on a policy standpoint related to that, and I'll close with this, Mr. Chairman. One is, I do think there is room, and I've suggested this, I know, to you before COVID, and I think COVID has proven the point. I do think there is room for a more structured relationship between state-level enforcers, in our case, an Attorney General's office, and our regional federal law enforcement partners. What I mean by that is, the federal agencies receive a lot of information. They get a lot of complaints directly from our citizens. Sometimes citizens don't come to us, they go directly to a federal agency. The feds are limited in terms of the size of scams and ripoffs they often will look at. They may or may not admit it, but the reality is they have to make choices, and they naturally look at the larger cases. That's perfectly understandable. But sometimes, and we've done this on occasion, it is very helpful if, when our federal partners receive a complaint and they've worked it up in part because they're trying to figure out what they got, and it turns out they've got a violation of law, but it doesn't rise to the level for federal prosecution or consideration, it is very helpful if they will then present it to us as a prosecuting entity, and we can prosecute those cases under state law. Well, we've done that particularly with HHS OIG out of the regional office before. And it makes us very happy because it gives us more cases in our pipeline, and it seemed to make them very happy, I think, because they have a place to send smaller cases that they've already invested time and effort in, but don't rise to the level routinely of federal prosecution. And then the second and final thing I'd suggest for consideration, Mr. Chairman, There is one thing pending in the Senate that would be very helpful, I think, in advancing our capacity on some of this. It's Senate Bill 2379. I know you're a co-sponsor. I think others on the subcommittee are, and we have talked about it. It's a measure that's been pending for several years now, and I'm hopeful that it's got a path, perhaps as part of the next stimulus bill, if there is one. But it would remove what I think is an arbitrary barrier in federal law that currently prohibits states from using our Medicaid fraud control units to detect, investigate, or prosecute Medicaid patient abuse, as opposed to systemic fraud, but patient abuse, unless that abuse occurs in an institutional setting. So from a COVID standpoint, what that means is, if I've got somebody that we discover somehow is ripping off, is defrauding a Medicaid beneficiary in a home health care setting, trying to sell them bogus cures or whatever it may be for COVID, I currently am not allowed to use our Medicaid fraud control unit assets, which are partially federally funded and therefore subject to federal limitation, to investigate and prosecute that. I've got to find some other way to do it with some other resources. I can't figure out why that is, other than it's a historical anomaly. And it would be very helpful if that limitation were lifted swiftly, because it would allow us to deploy already existing and in place investigation and prosecution resources to address non-institutional COVID scams. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to present the information.
General, thank you for your efforts in our home state to protect consumers. Thanks for your testimony today, and thanks for your specific suggestions about federal actions. Now we turn to our next witness, Mr. Andrew Smith. He is the Director, Bureau of Consumer Protection at the Federal Trade Commission.
Thank you. Chairman Moran, Ranking Member Blumenthal, and members of the subcommittee. I'm Andrew Smith, the Director of the Federal Trade Commission's Bureau of Consumer Protection. My written statement represents the views of the Commission, but this opening statement represents my views alone and not necessarily the views of the Commission or of any individual commissioner. I'm pleased to appear before you today to discuss protecting Americans from COVID-19 scams. Despite the disruption of the coronavirus pandemic, the Bureau of Consumer Protection has managed to be aggressive, creative, and productive, particularly with respect to scams taking advantage of COVID-19 fear and confusion. Many of our specific initiatives of the last 4 months are outlined in my written testimony, but what is truly remarkable to me is how the entire Bureau of Consumer Protection has risen to the occasion and made a major contribution to the fight against COVID scams. Each of our 8 divisions and 8 regional offices is pulling its weight in the fight against COVID scams, while also keeping up with its existing load of projects and cases. Our Advertising Practices Division is taking action against fake cures. Our Marketing Practices Division is taking on robocalls and spurious business opportunities. Our Privacy Division is focused on video conferencing, contact tracing, and issues around EdTech and distance learning. Our Financial Practices Division is fighting small business financing fraud. Our Enforcement Division is taking on fulfillment scams that promise PPE to consumers, but that never deliver. Our Consumer Response Division is collecting and analyzing complaint data for public consumption, as well as improved law enforcement targeting. Our Litigation Support Division is assisting with innovative ways to continue to do our work remotely, including remote courtroom appearances, testimony, and document production. Our Division of Business and Consumer Education has produced dozens of blog posts, infographics, shareables, videos, and other material in 5 different languages on the wide range of COVID scams, and has also been conducting extensive outreach directly and through our partners in the media, advocacy organizations, and trade groups. And our regional offices are doing all of the above, actively engaged in warning letters, investigations, litigation, and TROs, outreach, and more outreach with state and regional partners. In fact, just in the car on the way up here, I got an email about a joint letter that our Chicago office had done with the Missouri Attorney General on warning letter to 2 separate companies warning them against making fake claims for COVID relief in connection with hearing aids. Just within the last hour, we did that. None of the work that we're doing, however, would be possible without the cooperation and coordination with our federal, state, and local partners, as well as the private sector. Working with FDA, we've sent dozens of warning letters to dietary supplement sellers. We've been working with the Federal Communications Commission and the U.S. Telecom Industry Traceback Group to halt illegal robocallers. Working with SBA, we've taken action against companies offering PPP financing to small businesses without SBA approval. Some of our enforcement actions have been in conjunction with DOJ or other criminal authorities who execute search warrants at the same time as we go to court for an emergency TRO. State regulators and AGs are joining us in warning letters or taking action against recipients of our FTC warning letters. Foreign regulators and criminal authorities in India, Singapore, Canada, and Sweden have worked with us on investigations and enforcement. Some of the private partnerships have been just as remarkable. I mentioned the U.S. Telecom Robocall Traceback Initiative, which has been invaluable in leading us to the source of illegal robocalls. Our partnerships with BBBs and AARP have enabled us to reach literally millions of consumers with our educational message. In fact, one AARP presentation early in the pandemic was viewed by more than 850,000 people. We are always open to new ideas about how to better educate and protect consumers from these pernicious COVID-related scams, and I look forward to today's conversation on this topic. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith. Now, Mr. Stu Showerman, founder and chief executive officer, KnowBe4, Inc.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to provide my perspective as Congress works toward developing solutions for businesses and governments combating COVID-19 related scams and what more can be done to protect the public. My name is Stu Showerman. I am the founder and CEO of KnowBe4 Inc. We are headquartered in Tampa Bay, Florida, with offices in Europe, South America, Australia, and Southeast Asia. KnowBe4 is the provider of the world's largest security awareness training and simulated phishing platform. Our services are used by more than 33,000 organizations with 24 million employees around the globe. And for the last 30 years, I've served as an entrepreneur and data security expert in the IT industry. I founded an anti-malware company called Sunbelt Software, which got multiple Inc. 500 awards and was acquired in 2010. And as I was running that company, I realized that the human element of security was being seriously neglected. So I decided to help organizations to manage the ongoing problem of cybercrime's social engineering tactics. And that is why I founded KnowBe4 to provide new school security awareness training. More than 33,000 organizations in a variety of industries, including highly regulated fields such as healthcare, finance, energy, government, and insurance, have mobilized their end users as their last line of defense using KnowBe4. Our primary objective is to enable employees, and they are also, of course, consumers, to make smarter security decisions by training them to become a human firewall in defense against social engineering attacks, which are responsible for upwards of 90% of data breaches. The shutdowns and the economic turmoil of the coronavirus pandemic have expanded the cyber attack surface, making it even easier for hackers and scammers to do their nefarious acts. If we don't focus on the human element, consumers and employees, we ignore a crucial part of cybersecurity. So since the beginning of this year, COVID-19 has quickly reshaped the cyber threat landscape. For instance, over 192 coronavirus-related phishing attacks have occurred per week over the last month. No one is immune to being scammed, and different types of scams target different sets of consumers. Scammers go to great lengths to make their attacks as convincing as possible, and many of these scams have very few visible signs that could tip off the recipients. The best way to fight scammers is to, of course, prevent, educate consumers and employees with a combination of security awareness training and frequent social engineering testing. Here's one example. New data from security vendor Tripwire highlights how the shift to remote working has changed the face of cybersecurity for both current and future work climate. According to their report, 94% of organizations are more concerned about cybersecurity than before COVID-19, and they should be. The fact is that people are clicking on simulated COVID-19 phishing attacks at high rates, and coronavirus-themed emails are rampant. The emphasis in cybersecurity has traditionally been on hardware and software. However, we cannot solely rely on that. This strategy can't catch everything, nor does it address the need for a human firewall. So, to end off, any support from Congress that would direct government agencies to implement ongoing security awareness training, more than just annual training that is typically in place, and include frequent social engineering testing would be greatly beneficial as we work together to bridge the gap in cybersecurity and protect American networks. So thank you for the opportunity to share KnowBe4's perspective on cybersecurity and our industry's unique ability to protect American citizens from rising COVID-19 related social engineering scams. We're grateful to Chairman Moran and the members of the committee for the time and effort you are all putting into this important matter of national security. KnowBe4 is committed to being a helpful partner going forward as we all work to serve the best interest of the public. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Now, Ms. Laura McCleary, Policy Director, Center for Science in the Public Interest. Welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Moran and Ranking Member Blumenthal, for the honor of testifying today on this critical topic. I'm Policy Director for Center for Science in the Public Interest, a nearly 50-year-old organization that works to improve the health of the food supply and the interests of consumers. Americans are facing an unprecedented challenge in keeping themselves and their families safe during a pandemic. Public health officials emphasize that we all need to socially distance, wear a mask, and wash our hands. Understandably, though, many people are looking for more to protect themselves, and those without scruples are actively exploiting consumer fear and anxiety. In truth, our underregulated marketplace for dietary supplements is a risky place under any conditions. For the past 3 years, we've been collecting evidence of scams concerning supplements and sending it to the Food and Drug Administration and the Federal Trade Commission. These included many misleading claims we found on products marketed to vulnerable consumers suffering from opioid and tobacco addiction, as well as supplements making false claims on female fertility. It is far too tempting to think that a powder or a supplement can help us with a global pandemic. When the coronavirus appeared, we knew the hucksters would not be far behind. First, we wrote the FDA and FTC about televangelist Jim Baker, whom we heard Senator Blumenthal describe. That show featured experts advancing the claim that the products it sold containing colloidal silver could cure coronavirus, quote, within 12 hours. The commentators on the same show had previously claimed that the same product cures, quote, all venereal diseases as well as HIV. Yet there's no evidence that silver supplements prevent or treat any condition, according to the National Institutes of Health. Although experts featured on the show claimed that it could be consumed daily in slurps and was, quote, safe for babies, colloidal silver in large enough amounts can be dangerous to kidneys and other organs. It can also cause permanent bluish-gray discoloration of a person's skin and organs. Also in June, we sent another request to the FDA and FTC asking for enforcement on supplements being marketed as antiviral claims. Any claim that a supplement has antiviral properties is considered an illegal disease claim by the FDA because only drugs can cure or treat disease. Our market scan of products on Amazon in late May found 46 dietary supplements making illegal antiviral claims. So we wrote the agencies and Amazon directly for removal. Unfortunately, a subsequent search of Amazon performed on June 29th found that 26 of those supplements are still making antiviral claims on their own websites, on Amazon, or other online stores. We continue to be on the lookout for scams related to COVID claims. Just this morning, we sent public letters to the FDA and FTC asking for the agencies to act to address dozens of misleading claims made by about 23 supplements and medical devices by Dr. Joseph Mercola, a well-known purveyor of dietary supplements. In a pandemic, such untruths pose a clear and urgent danger. Consumers may develop a false sense of security and fail to practice social distancing or use masks, endangering themselves or everyone around them. They also may harm themselves by taking dangerous doses of supplements or fail to seek effective medical treatment, believing instead in the promises of charlatans. But it's even worse than that. On a recent episode of Mercola's podcast, he actually advises consumers to take the immunity-boosting supplements he sells and then deliberately attempt to contract COVID-19 because his supplements will allegedly reduce their symptoms. Dietary supplements are, in fact, among the most poorly regulated consumer products. Congress, through the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act of 1994, established a bare-bones system of oversight that was designed to be weak. Today, particularly given the tremendous expansion of products and use by consumers over the past 26 years, that system is failing. Both the FDA and the FTC need more funding, personnel, and resources for enforcement. The FDA in particular needs far better tools, including a mandatory product registration requirement to make the marketplace transparent for regulators and consumers. In addition, Congress should authorize state attorneys general to enforce relevant federal laws related to dietary supplements to improve their accountability and reach. And the FDA should be given heightened regulatory powers for specific categories of supplements that are known to pose a high risk to consumers because they are marketed to vulnerable groups or are commonly tainted with drugs and synthetic ingredients. We would appreciate the opportunity to work with lawmakers on a vision for reform of supplement oversight to ensure that consumers are protected from fraud. It should not take a pandemic to motivate solutions to require that supplements, like any consumer product, are truthfully labeled and marketed, and that consumers are not misled in ways that risk their own and public health. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much for your presence and testimony. Let me begin with a question initially for Mr. Smith. On April the 14th, Senator Blumenthal and I sent a letter to FTC Chairman Joseph Simons asking if the FTC currently had the authority under its relatively flexible Section 5 authority to enforce against unfair and deceptive acts or practices to deal with the issue of price gouging. On May the 19th, the chairman responded indicating there are significant legal challenges under our current statutory authority to address price gouging allegations, and they rely heavily on the DOJ and state attorney generals to enforce such activities. Mr. Smith, historically, the FTC has not used its Section 5 authority related to those unfair and deceptive acts or practices to take enforcement actions related to price gouging. If Congress were to legislate to explicitly direct the FTC to address price gouging, would you have recommendations for this subcommittee as to what that should look like?
Right. So you're right. that historically the commission has not, there have been these supply shocks, following natural disasters and the like, and the commission has been asked, could the unfairness authority fit the increased prices that follow those supply shocks? And the commission has historically been reluctant to use its unfairness authority in that way. I would note that at least 35 other states have UDAP authority as well, similar to our unfairness authority, but have seen fit to enact price gouging statutes, including Kansas. General Schmidt in his written remarks talked a bit about that, and the state of Connecticut and a lot of other states. We think that a special law would be helpful here. And with respect to that law, what we have, and we've worked with some of your offices on this, what we would recommend is that the crisis to which the statute applies be clearly defined, and that it be truly national in scope, not one of these regional or local supply shocks that might call upon the National Federal Trade Commission to address those issues, so that there be a narrowly defined or at least clearly defined national crisis that the statute applies to, that it be nice if it were to define the types of materials or products or services that would be covered, for example, PPE in the current crisis, that there be a clearly defined trigger, such as an increase in price over a pre-crisis index. So 25% increase in price, for example, is what some of the state laws account for. And also that there be some acknowledgement that increased costs might be legitimate. So, for example, if there's a disruption in the supply chain and a merchant needs to find alternative supplies and it results in increased costs, we don't want to discourage that. We want to encourage new entrants to the marketplace. We don't want to discourage people from providing critical goods and services simply because their costs have increased. So I think that those 3 or 4 items that I've outlined would be really helpful in any national price gouging legislation.
Thank you. You mentioned the state of Kansas. Let me turn to the Attorney General. General Schmidt, we do have a law in place, as you indicated and Mr. Smith indicated. Tell me if you would describe your office's efforts in enforcing that law, that state law.
Mr. Chairman, we do. After the 9/11 attacks, the state of Kansas enacted what is now known as our Profiteering from Disaster Statute, which in the colloquial would be our anti-price gouging law. The way it is structured is that it is in effect only during a time and in the place, in the geographical area, of a declared state of emergency, either by our governor or by the president. So those are the 2 triggers that cause the law to enter into force. The standard is any unjustified increase of pricing as compared with the price for a particular product or service on the day before the emergency was declared. And unjustified, there's a presumption that something was unjustified if it's 25% or more increase, although if it's a pass-through cost, as Mr. Smith suggested, that negates the presumption and also operates as a defense. And it applies to what the statute calls necessary goods or services, which are further defined as essentially things that consumers are likely to need more of as a result of the particular emergency. So that's the structure of our statute. To your question about our efforts to enforce it, it has been enforced in effect now in Kansas longer and in a more widespread way than ever before during the COVID response because of the nature of the emergency. We have approached this. We've received, last I looked, it was somewhere around 400 complaints from Kansans alleging a violation of that statute. We've investigated them all or are investigating them all. And generally speaking, we've approached this through education or engagement with the supplier, with the retailer. A lot of times we discover they didn't know that the law existed because it's so rarely in effect. Other times it's plain on its face that they're simply passing through costs that were raised for them, so we can then go up the supply chain to figure out if there's anything unlawful happening. So we've tried to approach it in that way. We have not at this point had to actually file an enforcement action. We have had a number of suppliers change their behavior once we've engaged with them, however.
Well, thank you. I now turn to a former state attorney general, the ranking member, Senator Blumenthal.
Yeah, I want to welcome you, particularly Attorney General Schmidt, and thank you for the good work you're doing out there. And I think you provide evidence as to one of the recommendations that Ms. McCleary makes about the need for authority on the part of state attorneys general to enforce federal laws. So let me ask, if I may, Mr. Smith, what you think about giving state attorneys general broader authority.
So generally, so I'm speaking just for myself, right? Not for the commission or for any individual commissioner. A lot of the consumer protection laws that we currently enforce have authority for state attorneys general to enforce them as well. And I think that's terrific, honestly. And it's a big help for us. I think that if the state attorneys general are willing to share some of the load with respect to enforcement, we are delighted for that. I would say that typically when there is a provision permitting state attorney general enforcement, that the Federal Trade Commission or whomever the relevant federal authority might be have an opportunity, that it receives notice of the case before being filed and that it have an opportunity to intervene. But with those safeguards, I think that, traditionally, we at the Federal Trade Commission have been in favor of state AG enforcement of the federal statutes that we enforce.
Ms. McCleary, I want to thank you for the work that your organization does. The Center for Science in the Public Interest really does magnificent research and policy formulation. And I think what you've done on these fake and phony cures is show not only that there's a financial cost, but also that they have serious adverse side effects. And I don't mean only the potential physical dangers medically. I mean the sense of false security that may cause complacency, a failure to practice good preventive action like wearing masks and physical distancing, and the kinds of dangers that they pose when people talk about them and exaggerate them to their friends or neighbors. So I think there's a special responsibility on the part of everyone who is involved in promoting these products. And I note in your testimony that you make reference to Amazon, eBay, Facebook, and Etsy, and I'm quoting, must do a far better job of removing misleading claims and products. Shouldn't they be held accountable?
Yes. I think that there has been a perception that the third-party platforms are just a marketplace without a stake in the game. Increasingly, we see that that is not the right understanding of the model. They profit from having all the sellers on their platform. They learn tremendous amounts about the marketplace and the behavior of buyers and sellers. They often produce their own products, in the case of Amazon or Walmart, which has a big online presence, and sell them directly to sellers. And they should be asked to help patrol the viability of claims on the marketplaces that they're managing. The antiviral complaints that we filed have been very disappointing to see their lack of response on the part of Amazon to those. They are doing some coordination, is my understanding from news reports, with the Department of Homeland Security around COVID products that are specifically marketed to treat or prevent COVID, which is commendable. And what we'd like to do is see more of that sort of shared enforcement model. Amazon has been found liable in court for selling foods that should have been recalled after they were identified by the CDC as having a foodborne pathogen. In addition, we were working with a family that lost their son for unwashed poppy seed tea, which is an opiate, and was sold through Amazon in bulk amounts to be used for this purpose. And it was clear from the comments that these were used for drug purposes. So those are the kinds of things that we see. And we think that there could be a much more compelling partnership between the platforms and the government to deal with fraud and abuse.
They could be much more aggressive, and don't they have an obligation to be more aggressive? If you search for COVID cure on Amazon, you still find sponsored banners for probiotics and product listings for supplement. Aren't they complicit along with other marketplaces? And have you been satisfied with their response to your complaints?
I think they have a tricky job controlling the algorithm, which might in part be learning from consumer practices in real time on their site, but I don't know enough about how the Amazon search engine works because it's not very clear from looking over the site protocols. So that would be an area for investigation by Congress or the agencies in consultation with the company. I do think where we have flagged items like the antiviral claims, which are per se illegal claims according to the Food and Drug Administration, they have a clear obligation to act. And there are also supplements that are tainted with prescription drugs that have been sold through Amazon, and those need to be expeditiously removed as soon as platforms are informed that they are tainted.
Thank you. My first round, I hope there will be a second round, Mr. Chairman, has expired, so I'll yield back and hope that we can ask some more questions.
We'll follow our usual practice of not informing the other committee members whether there'll be a second round or not until we see how many people are here. We now turn to the full committee chairman, who's certainly entitled to a second round. Senator Wicker, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Senator Moran. I appreciate the work that you and Senator Blumenthal are doing on this issue. I have a prepared statement that I will ask be included in the record following the opening statement of Senator Blumenthal.
Without objection.
Thank you very much. And I've very much enjoyed the testimony. Mr. Smith, we are looking right now in the House and Senate at a COVID-19 response bill, the Phase 4, and this is a good opportunity for I think us to see if you need anything in that bill. Ms. McCleary says that FTC does not have enough funding or enforcement tools to go after the scammers. And so, but you haven't asked for any additional full-time equivalents. So one thing I'd like for you to discuss is you have enough resources to fulfill the task that we're talking about today. And then with regard to following up on Senator Blumenthal's question about state attorneys general, maybe that's a way for us indeed to spread some of the responsibility and let the 50 attorneys generals be involved in this. When you have been able to farm out work to attorneys general, Mr. Smith, does that involve a state enforcement mechanism only, or are there damages requested? Do you ever outsource that to the trial bar in enforcing anything that the FTC does? So if you could comment on that, I'd appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. So I'll go with the resources first. At this point, we haven't identified any costs that we can't cover, but we do appreciate very much the additional funding that the House Appropriation Committee has recommended for the Commission in FY 2021. We also appreciate the extra resources that we got in FY 2020. And whatever resources we get, we will put to good use. I will say that we do, though, have two very specific needs. The first is legislation to address our authority under Section 13B of the FTC Act. So this is the primary provision that we use to return money to consumers. And for decades, courts across the country have said that we have authority to obtain equitable monetary relief under Section 13B. Very recently, court in the Seventh Circuit has questioned that. And so this is the first court to do that. The great weight of the authority is still on the FTC's side, but this is an issue that has been teed up in front of the Supreme Court for next term. And we expect the court to resolve that issue by the middle of 2021. But an adverse ruling from the Supreme Court would mean that the FTC would lose the ability to get any monetary relief under Section 13B of the FTC Act, as we have been doing for decades. Because the stakes are so high, we're asking Congress to act now to ensure that the FTC can continue returning money to consumers. Second issue where we could use some help is reauthorization of the Safe Web Act. Safe Web Act was last reauthorized in 2012, right, 2012. It will sunset on September 30 of this year. It extends the FTC's UDAP authority, Unfair and Deceptive Practices Authority, to conduct that has a reasonably foreseeable effect on U.S. consumers or that involves material conduct in the U.S. This allows us to address cross-border fraud, which is a real problem. Since 2015, we've had 310,000 complaints from U.S. consumers against foreign businesses. The other thing that SafeWeb allows us to do is more easily exchange confidential investigative information with our foreign counterparts. We've relied on SafeWeb to respond to 162 information sharing requests from 40 enforcement agencies in 17 foreign countries. It's been a critically important tool. And a lot of the COVID-19 fraud that we see is also coming from overseas or Canada. So, two things that we could really use help with, 13B and SafeWeb. With respect to state AGs, we routinely have we participate in task forces, regular meetings with our state AG counterparts. They will frequently be co-plaintiffs in our cases, particularly charity cases, where they have better authority than we do to return money to consumers. We sometimes refer cases to them. They sometimes refer cases to us. We have, one of our biggest recent cases was our $170 million settlement with Google and YouTube. That was a case that we did with the New York Attorney General. Critically,
did they farm it out to the trial bar?
We have not. We haven't farmed anything out to the trial bar, and our state partners, as far as I know, we've been dealing with, assistant attorneys general. We haven't been dealing with private lawyers who are hired by the attorney general. In my experience, that's been what we've seen. But I haven't also been participating in a lot of these in a lot of these task forces. That's generally done by the folks in our regional offices. So I can't say for sure about outsourcing to the trial bar, but I've never heard of it in our case.
Mr. Chairman, we're way over time. I would note that you and Senator Thune, Senator Blackman, and I, and Fisher have a data privacy bill that would deal with this specific issue with COVID-19. And perhaps on the record, our witnesses might tell us if they've had a chance to look at that and if they want to go ahead and on the record enthusiastically endorse this great piece of legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, would you like the witnesses to respond to that question now?
I'll be glad to. I just don't want to intrude on your time. But if they could respond within your constraints, I'd love to hear.
Let's do it very quickly. Derek Schmidt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Based on the sponsors, I have no doubt that it is excellent legislation, but I have not had a chance to review it.
That probably means you're offending half of the members of the United States Senate, but Senator Blumenthal and I continue our efforts in this regard. Mr. Smith?
So, I can't speak for the commission, but we institutionally believe that contact tracing legislation would be a big help. Consumers really need to be able to trust these contact tracing apps if they're going to work, and the app developers need to know the rules of the road. So having legislation, Commission has testified in favor of broad privacy legislation, but that failing, contract tracing legislation would be great too.
Mr. Showerman? Is this within your domain?
I have not been able to look at this particular bit of legislation, so I can't afford an opinion. Of course, these things are incredibly important. They cover part of the problem. If you take this just a slightly bit more to the 30,000-foot level, you would like to see federal/national cybersecurity standards, not the patchwork of current different state cybersecurity standards, which can prevent a multitude of these types of scams in a variety of ways. But maybe we can come back to that particular issue a little later.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Ms. McClary.
We'd certainly be pleased to review the bill, but I haven't had a chance to focus on data privacy. I regret to say. I do have more information on the funding and resources question, if that's of interest to the chair.
I'll try to make certain that each of you have an opportunity to respond at the end of the hearing to kind of catch up with anything that you would like to add to your testimony. Let me turn now to Senator Klobuchar, who's been patiently waiting.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Senator Blumenthal as well for holding this really, really important hearing today. I think we all know that we are in, yes, a public health crisis, but also an economic crisis. And sadly, when that happens, there are people who prey on people's vulnerabilities. While scammers have used, as you pointed out at the beginning of your remarks, Senator Moran and Blumenthal, they've used the coronavirus to exploit Americans' fears. The impacts of the scam on seniors have been particularly disturbing. Reports have found that 8 out of 10 people in this country who have lost their lives to coronavirus are seniors, and that the seniors who also lose an estimated $3 billion annually to financial scams in a normal time have been targeted for additional scams. Just last week in my state, we had a scammer that pretended to be the child of an elderly Minnesotan and convinced that person to send $25,000 to an address in Connecticut. Not to pick that out, Senator Blumenthal, but yes, Connecticut. That's why Senator Moran and I introduced the Protecting Seniors from Emergency Scams Act in May to help prevent scammers from taking advantage of seniors during the pandemic. And we've also called on the FTC to protect seniors from some of the contact tracing scams that you've all discussed and to educate seniors on how to protect themselves. So I think I would start with Ms. McCleary. Could you talk about how it is critical for seniors and their caregivers to have access to resources from law enforcement, adult protective agencies to help combat these coronavirus scams? And also with the rise of online shopping fraud in which consumer products are ordered online, what is the FTC doing to protect seniors from these types of scams?
Thank you so much, Senator. I so appreciate the care that you and the chairman are showing for this very vulnerable population. We know that seniors, for example, in our work, are very heavy users of dietary supplements. 82% of people ages 55 to 64 and 88% of those 65 and older take vitamins and supplements. And we've been very concerned that the supplements actually deliver on the benefits that are promised on the label. We sued CVS several years ago for producing a supplement that was a CVS label that promised to have macular degeneration ingredients in it that were effective and in fact lacked those ingredients even though it was sold next to a product that had the appropriate ingredient. So seniors are particularly vulnerable to supplement scams in the way that we've highlighted. They also tend to be vulnerable to the kinds of marketing scams in the supplement marketplace. That is, buy-back guarantees and money-back promises and phishing scams related to those kinds of product marketing. So that's of real concern to us, and their health makes them more vulnerable to gaps in those supplements or the use of the supplements as substitution for valid medical treatment. It may displace a visit to a doctor that's actually needed.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Smith, I'll direct this one toward you. Is the FTC planning to take additional measures to better protect seniors, assist them with this if they're a victim of a contact tracing scam? And I know the FTC is coordinating with the DOJ and HHS to warn consumers. Can you highlight the key measures the FTC is taking as part of this coordination?
Sure. Older Americans have been a priority of ours for a long time. Interestingly, our research shows that older Americans are not necessarily victimized at a higher rate than younger people. In fact, they're victimized at a somewhat lower rate. But they suffer more losses when they do suffer a monetary loss. And some of that has to do with scams like the grandparent scam that Senator Klobuchar outlined, which is really pernicious. And can lead to big losses. And so our efforts are, in addition to our law enforcement efforts, our efforts are focused on educating consumers, particularly to these scams. And one of our most effective tools has been a campaign called Pass It On. And what Pass It On does, it's a series of articles, presentations, bookmarks, activities, videos, and what it does is it educates it's targeted at older Americans, and it says, look, you need to give this information to your friend, to your neighbor, to your family member. You need to educate them about this scam. And it allows older people to capitalize on their life experience and their wisdom in educating others. And of course, and in educating others, they're also educating themselves. So we've distributed millions of pieces of this information, and we found that it's effective, but you're absolutely right. There are always new scams, particularly those involving technology, tech support, contact tracing, where they're going to find, the scammers will find fertile ground with older consumers.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Schmidt, one last question. In your testimony, you note the legislation enacted in Kansas to protect the privacy of consumers' personal data. Do you think that providing strong protections for consumers' personal data is helpful in making these contract tracing apps more effective? And what more do you think we should be doing federally on the personal data? A number of us have been trying to work on privacy issues, Senator Cantwell, otherwise as well, when it comes to personal data. And this goes way beyond the pandemic. I think that's only put a magnifying glass on this issue with the tech companies and the like. But what do you think would be helpful?
Right. So the commission has testified in favor of data security legislation that would include civil penalty authority, APA rulemaking authority, and expanded jurisdiction for the FTC over common carriers and nonprofits. A majority of commissioners have testified for something similar with respect to privacy legislation. And speaking just for myself, I think that privacy legislation would be really helpful now to both tell app developers and others who might be working on contract tracing issues, let them know what the rules of the road are, what's protected, what they can collect, what the contours of de-identified and aggregated data are, as an example. And it also would build confidence by consumers. Consumers need to be confident in these apps if they're going to use them and if they're going to be effective.
That's for sure. Mr. Schmidt, could you also answer that one? Thanks.
We've obviously followed with interest many of your discussions and debates in Washington on broader privacy issues. And of course, from a state standpoint, we always have generalized concerns about preemption, the tension between state authority on the one hand and on the other hand, the benefits of a national standard. Setting that bigger issue aside that I assume would also be a challenge for you at this point if you were trying to do something quickly on this federally. Kansas did, our legislature was in special session in June and did at that point enact, at the suggestion of our office, what we call the Contact Tracing Privacy Act at the state level. It's, I think, fairly characterized as stopgap legislation. It sunsets next May. It's designed to fill the immediate need while we have perhaps a more thoughtful review of what the law ought to look like with respect to contact tracing. It has multiple parts, some of which are not relevant to your question, but essentially it requires that contact tracing was largely unregulated, even though it has deep roots and is a critically important public health tool. At least in Kansas, there weren't many rules of the road. It just sort of was operated the way the public health officials chose to operate it. And obviously the scale of the COVID response has brought a lot more people into that business and therefore invited discussion about what the rules ought to be. So our new statute does things such as requiring, specifying that participation in contact tracing, whether it's electronic or whether it's the old-fashioned way with pencil and pen and knocking on a door, is voluntary. We think that's important because it reduces some of the pushback that some citizens have when the government tells them they must provide information under some sort of penalty. Our statute, again, a stopgap, actually flat prohibits the use of cell phone location information, so most of the apps for contact tracing, our public health department at the state level said they weren't interested in doing that at this point, and we thought it advisable to put the whole thing on hold until there can be a more thoughtful review of what exactly the rules ought to be on that, again, in the spirit of trying to reassure folks that it's okay to participate without having to wonder what happens to your information. And we also, in that statute, ensure that there can't be what I've called bureaucratic mission creep. We ensure that the data lawfully and appropriately collected for contact tracing for COVID, when it's no longer needed for that contact tracing purpose, must be safely and securely destroyed, because there's obviously going to be tremendous value in a lot of this data for reasons we may not even have thought about yet and that may be beneficial. But again, folks may be really discouraged from participating if they think it's an open door to what their information might eventually be used for. So that's been our approach.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Senator Moran.
You're welcome, Senator Klobuchar. Now, Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you holding this hearing today. American consumers have had to become suspicious of all types of fraud that comes to their emails, to their telephones, to their mailboxes, and sometimes to their front doors. On top of this, the coronavirus pandemic has been a convergence of all of these potential scams and brought them into one. It's increasingly difficult to determine what's real and what isn't. We saw this recently in my state of Nebraska when consumers were confused after they received their valid stimulus money from the CARES Act in the form of prepaid debit cards from the U.S. Treasury. And many of them thought it was a scam, so they threw them away. Thankfully, the Treasury has been responsive on resolving these issues. We've also seen some skepticism from consumers contacted from government agencies for contact tracing efforts. Mr. Smith, in light of these going forward, what can we do to improve trusted channels between the federal government and the
Well, what we're doing at the FTC is educating consumers about contact tracing and the like, so that they can be, because we want consumers to engage with contact tracers. And so we don't want them simply to be afraid and to shut down when they get that email. And so our message is don't be afraid to engage with contact tracers, but the first thing is don't click on any link in that text message, just like General Schmidt said. Second, a contact tracer, a legitimate contact tracer, will never ask you for money, for your bank account, for your social security number, or for your immigration status. In addition, on our website, ftc.gov/coronavirus/scams, we have contact information for all the different state boards of health and other information about contact tracing to educate consumers about legitimate contact tracing. But you're absolutely right that we need to build trust, or consumers need to be able to trust these apps if they're going to work in the way that they're intended to work.
What are you looking at for best practices there? Are you trying to reach out to state government more to be able to work together so that we can build that consumer confidence?
Well, we've issued a great deal of business guidance, including business guidance for contact tracers and for app developers, where we've been counseling app developers to employ privacy and security by design at the beginning of the app development process, not simply build it in at the end, that they include privacy protective design features for their apps, such as decentralization of data, so the data lives on individual devices rather than in one centralized database, that they use anonymous data or even better aggregated data, so think, heat maps for coronavirus, for these contact tracing apps. They use the data only for the stated purposes, just like General Schmidt said. If you're collecting it for public health, you use it for that. You use it for nothing else, and you delete the data when you no longer need it. So those best practices would be relevant to a private entity developing a contact tracing app or to a state board of health that's developing a contact tracing app.
Thank you. And General Schmidt, I noticed that you commented on the enforcement actions that your office recently has taken related to COVID-19 scams. As you've carried out those investigations over the last few months, do you feel that there has been adequate and proactive coordination from the FTC as well as the Justice Department with state AGs on these COVID-related issues and other issues as well?
Yes, I do, Senator. We have a very good pre-existing relationship with our counterparts at the relevant federal agencies, both in regional offices to the extent they're in Kansas City at least, or nationally to the extent they may not have a regional presence in Kansas City. And I think those pre-existing relationships have been really helpful in allowing us to simply apply how we normally work together in this context. So I feel very good about that. As I suggested in my opening, I think there might be some room to maybe in a more institutional way, I don't mean legislation, but just in a more institutional way to ensure that relationships that cause cases to flow federal to state or state to federal, for example, between the investigation and prosecution stage, that may happen even when there's changes in personnel, because so much of it becomes based upon those personal relationships and you feel like you have to reinvent the wheel. But beyond that, I feel good about it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Fisher. We're pleased to have the ranking member of the full committee here, Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Chairman Moran, and thank you to my colleague, Senator Blumenthal, for being the vice chair of the committee and for all your hard work on these issues. It's great to join you. And I think what I'll try to do is just talk about some very, very broad issues, if I could. I think my colleagues have covered a lot of territory. And first of all, let me just thank you for mentioning, and my colleague, Senator Klobuchar, the data security issue. Really feel that data security is and should be included. So thank you for endorsing that concept, that data security really does need attention along with privacy legislation overall. So thank you for that. On this issue of the, the usual FTC approach, which is a first-time warning, do the witnesses agree that the FTC needs a first-time civil penalty authority when it comes to some of these COVID, deceptive information and statements, given the severity of the problem? I don't know, Ms. McCleary, I don't know what you have to say, or whether Mr. Smith wants to comment on that.
So I think that the warning letter tool has limitations. There are a number of unscrupulous actors in the marketplace that may disregard warning letters, and it's enormously inefficient for the FDA or the FTC to have to track and go after bad actors multiple times. We have seen a pattern, even in supplements tainted with drugs like amphetamines. They will issue a warning letter, and then the company will come back with a slightly tweaked product and keep selling into the same marketplace. So I think for supplements in particular, you have a small number of bad actors, and a warning letter authority is just insufficient to get their attention.
Well, I definitely agree. We were very involved in drafting a new law as it related to, the same on our opioid crisis. We didn't put enough oomph behind the penalties there. So I think we should look at this. I mean, a civil penalty, given something that's about protecting the lives of individuals in the middle of a pandemic when people are reaching, for solutions, seems a reasonable approach. Mr. Smith, did you want to add anything to that? I have a different question for you, so.
Okay. I would just say, I think your question was about like the opiate law, where under Section 5, we bring in enforcement action and we're entitled to equitable monetary relief and injunction, things like that, but no penalties, right? And if we get an administrative order for the second go-round, we can get civil penalties. And so I think that's what your question was focused on, not so much the warning letters. And I would
I'm
say,
saying I think the warning letters in the middle of a pandemic on things that people might think are life-saving when then actually they're,
Right.
causing could cause fatalities. Seems like a warning letter may not be strong enough given the complexity of this environment we're in and giving the FTC a stronger tool.
right. Well, so we have a stronger tool. We can go to court with respect to every one of the companies that we've sent a warning letter to. We can go to federal court or in front of our administrative law judge, and we can get an injunction. We have chosen the warning letter route because what we have found, particularly with respect to the fake cures, what we have found is that the warning letters are astonishingly effective. In 48 hours, we can get bad claims taken down. And where we can't, we follow up with law enforcement, either in a federal court or in front of our administrative law judges.
Well, what about flexibility? I mean,
So, and then I think
just
what
like
you're
what Ms.
advocating is another path where we get civil, like with the opiate law, where we get civil penalties on our first bite at the apple. And with respect to that, that's a better question for the commission. I would be getting pretty far out over my skis if I were to offer an opinion on whether we should have
what
civil
about our
penalties.
definition of price gouging? And I don't know this unfairness authority, that's what we, in Washington, prevent unfair and deceptive practices, pretty similar, I think, to where you guys are, but it is quite broad. So do we need to do more on defining the price gouging standard?
I think yes, it would be helpful to have a price gouging statute. If Congress wanted us to address price gouging specifically, it would be really helpful to have a statute that gave us specific authority and laid out specific guidelines for basically how high is too high. So 35 states, which have the same FTC Act authority that we do, they have the Unfair and Deceptive Acts or Practices Authority, they have nonetheless seen fit to enact a price gouging statute because the Unfairness Authority doesn't fit neatly. So that would be, if you want us to address price gouging, a statute would be a big help.
Well, we have one for you, so we'll get that.
Right.
So,
Right.
we've been involved in establishing a standard for you also on manipulation, and we thought that was quite helpful and very helpful to the CFTC and very helpful for the FERC. So we think clarity here is our friend, and we
Right.
think, or just like with the opioid law, like if people can get around it, they will. And so the stronger deterrent that we can have on the books and the penalties, the better, in my opinion. One last question I was going to ask about. Let's see. What else do we need to do on some of these, some of the larger organizations that have taken advantage of states on their paychecks and the programs for unemployment?
So are you talking about large businesses that have obtained, for example, Paycheck Protection Program loans?
I'm talking more about the abuse of the system of people signing up and getting, rings of people who have signed up to get. In the state of Washington, we've
Right.
had employment checks given to rings of.
Right.
Yeah.
So I would say, so General Schmidt from Kansas may have some thoughts on that. From the FTC's perspective, when we see that, I think we send it to the IRS or to their TIGTA, to their Inspector General because that's real criminal theft, right?
Yes.
From the government.
Yes.
And so it's not so much an FTC problem, but General Schmidt may have additional thoughts. I don't know.
Well, I just want to know what we're doing to share that, data in general. Obviously, identity theft and these issues are something that the FTC, so don't know how many
Right.
other states have addressed this or faced it, but I don't
So
know
we
if
do-
General Schmidt has something, if the, yeah. General Schmidt wants to offer something.
Senator, the only thing I might add, as I mentioned but didn't dwell on earlier, with respect particularly to unemployment benefits, which may or may not be precisely what you're asking about, but it's a similar genre. We have gotten a lot of complaints from folks alleging fraud in those benefit payments, identity theft, creating false identities to claim payment. The way we've been handling those, because under Kansas law, I don't have original criminal jurisdiction for that type of crime. So the way we've been handling those is to refer them to our state Department of Labor, which handles unemployment program, and they in turn then work with their federal counterparts whenever in their judgment it's appropriate to do so. So a little bit outside under Kansas law of our authority.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cantwell, thank you very much. Senator Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the ranking member for having this hearing. Very interesting, and it's interesting. I'm just going to kind of start on where Senator Cantwell left off, and that is the fraud on the unemployment compensation. We just had, I'm from West Virginia, we just had an instance where our unemployment commissioner basically said that somebody from the same IP address had applied for 50,000 different ways to get a benefit with, different names or tweaking different names. And I'm wondering, Attorney General Schmidt, you mentioned that this is an issue that's come up in Kansas, but I'm wondering, is it the magnitude of which we're seeing? And also, what additional resources would you need to combat something of this nature when a program is created this rapidly, but also to the great benefit of so many people?
Senator, from the vantage point of the Kansas Attorney General's office, we haven't seen that scope, but I'm quick to say we might not, because as I was just describing to Senator Cantwell, we aren't necessarily the face of the public response. Mm-hmm. The only thing I might add, it's something we have talked and thought about a bit here, because we've seen the reports in other states that the problems have been widespread, and I don't have a reason to think that Kansas is materially different. I just have not seen the data.
Right.
But there are other programs where there is a federal-state partnership, as there is now with the unemployment payments coming from the federal government to assist in extended benefits. Medicaid program comes to mind. And in some of those programs, Congress has seen fit to create certain requirements for fraud policing by the state in order to participate in the program. For example, the Medicaid fraud control units that I mentioned earlier. So I'm not prepared to advocate that in the unemployment insurance context, but it does seem to me a logical area to look, whether that model for programs that have shared funding would also make sense in the unemployment context for shared fraud enforcement.
I mean, I think a lot of our systems are very overwhelmed, as you know, and to try to determine where the fraud lies and how to detect it, I think is an issue. I'm going to stick with you, Mr. Attorney General, because I want to ask something that comes up in this committee all the time that has to be related to scams and certainly the education of either our elderly or others. And I appreciate Senator Klobuchar bringing up the scamming of the elderly. That's an issue I'm very concerned about in all aspects. But, we have a lack of broadband in our rural areas. And what do you find is the best way to really transmit to people who may not have broadband connectivity the possibility of false advertising or false claims or, cures that are going to cure it all or prevent you from ever getting COVID? How do you address that issue in Kansas?
So we are the lead consumer protection agency for the state at the state level in Kansas. And because of that, in ordinary times, we have a very robust consumer education and prevention program. We do it online, as you suggest. We also do a lot of in-person presentations around the state, whether it's civic clubs, nursing homes, senior centers. Our people spend a large proportion of their time actually talking with Kansans, because our philosophy is if we can help you avoid losing your money in the first place, it's better for you, it's better for us, so we can focus our enforcement on the back end on a smaller universe. Right. So that's how we normally do it. Now, as your question, I think, implies, right now, where we're all less mobile, we're doing things like we're doing today and communicating remotely. Obviously, that disables one of our principal tools for reaching Kansans, which is go where they are in person and talk with them. And so we've struggled with that. We are doing more online. We recognize the limits, as you suggest, that there are areas that's simply not going to be effective because our consumers aren't able to access that programming. But nonetheless, we think there is a significant number of Kansans who we don't normally reach online. We could reach online. Technologically, they're able. And so we're doing that now because it's better than not doing anything. So we've pushed that. But I have struggled very much with how we reach those pockets of individuals in the state that we can't reach digitally because they don't have suitable internet access. And we can't reach them physically right now because of
Right.
COVID-related restrictions. And I don't have a good answer right now.
Yeah, and I think that's a real problem because a lot of those are our more vulnerable populations, and I think it brings a difficult question. I don't know if I have any more time. I got one more question to Mr. Smith. We've seen a big increase in scams, obviously, and they're heading towards the vulnerable population, which we've said. But what limitations to the FTC? This is to my FTC. Let's see. Yeah, Mr. Smith. What limitations does the FTC have? And I've created an act with Senator Gardner called the CEASE Act, which would increase penalties for false advertising and deceptive acts. Wondering if that would be a helpful tool if you're aware of it, and what tools, additional tools you might need at the FTC to be able to break up these large advertising scams that we see.
Right, so I am familiar with the CEASE Act, and I think we may have provided some technical assistance to your offices, and we're happy to continue working with your office on that law. And with respect to specific tools that we could use, I mentioned earlier reauthorizing the Safe Web Act. I think Senators Moran and Blumenthal have co-sponsored a bill that would reauthorize the Safe Web Act. That's critically important for our foreign law enforcement. And some of these COVID scams are coming from outside of the country. The second thing is to clarify our authority under Section 13B of the FTC Act. So for decades and decades, we've had authority to obtain equitable monetary relief under Section 13B, and just recently there's been one important court, the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, which has called into question that authority. That issue is now in front of the Supreme Court. It will probably be resolved sometime next year about this time. But in the meantime, it would be great if Congress could act to clarify our authority that we can get redress, restitution, disgorgement, as Congress has thought we've been able to get for the last, probably 40 years.
Thank you very much.
Senator Capito, thank you. A vote has been called, and I have been very lenient in time. I'll try to be less so now. I'm sorry. Senator Udall, it's now your turn.
Thank you, Chairman Moran and Ranking Member Blumenthal for calling this hearing on the important issue of protecting our constituents from COVID-19 scams. There is unprecedented demand for products to protect against the transmission of coronavirus, and the scramble to keep our families, workers, and customers safe has led to a surge in scams and fraud against consumers. The FTC has received over 136,000 reports of scams related to COVID-19, including 477 from New Mexico. And people have reported losing nearly $90 million on these and other COVID-related frauds. But it's not just individual consumers that are at risk here. There are increasing reports of companies misrepresenting themselves in contracts with local, state, and federal agencies to procure PPE. In May, a $3 million Indian Health Service contract was given to a former White House official to provide 1 million KN95 respirator masks for use in the Indian Health Service facilities serving the Navajo Nation. These masks did not meet the Food and Drug Administration standards for use in healthcare settings by healthcare providers. I want to address the issue of some substandard masks. Thousands of masks procured by IHS were determined to be substandard and not for medical use for IHS hospitals serving the Navajo Nation in New Mexico and Arizona. I brought this up in another hearing directly with the IHS director and told him that this was absolutely unacceptable. Thankfully, the masks were never used, but HHS and FDA ought to be pretty savvy consumers when it comes to workplace safety in the medical field. I'll have a written question for our in-writing witness from the FDA, but Ms. McCleary, what can this administration do to better protect workers, both in the private sector and government? And do you support an OSHA emergency standard?
Absolutely. We are on record as supporting OSHA's development of an emergency temporary standard for workers at risk of contracting COVID. We've particularly been worried about meatpacking workers, where we've seen a large number of exposures and deaths, even among inspectors, but also workers. And it may be something about the working conditions or the close proximity there that lead these to be hotspots. Workers really need these protections in order to maintain our food supply and keep going to work, and we need a healthy workforce. So we're backing the measures that have come out of the Congress in several packages for an emergency temporary standard for workers. In addition, we think there should be a concerted effort to, of course, develop mask standards for workers in the healthcare setting. We know there's some of that going on underway, but some sort of concerted attention by the FDA to set standards. Masks in the healthcare setting have been to protect the patient from infection by the healthcare worker, not necessarily to protect the worker. And so there needs to be a new and urgent effort to ensure that workers in the settings where they're dealing with patients are also protected.
McCleary, are online platforms doing enough to put a stop to questionable and fraudulent goods before they are sold?
There certainly has been a concerted effort by Amazon and a few of the other platforms to work with federal authorities and get rid of explicitly marketed COVID cures and treatments. However, behind that, there's lots more work to do. In general, we need to have a plan for when platforms are selling supplements to the public and the false claims that they're making, and for actively patrolling them, not just during a pandemic. And in addition, not all platforms are making enough of an effort. We've looked across a number of the platforms, and not all of them are free of products that are explicitly promising to treat or prevent coronavirus, which is a problem.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, knowing that a vote is on and we're pressed for time, I'll submit the rest of my questions. I really believe there's a role for attorneys general to play here, and I hope that our witnesses will answer that question on the record, but I would yield back at this time. Thank you very much.
Ever so cooperative, Senator Udall. Thank you very much. Senator Baldwin. Senator Baldwin.
Oops. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Can you see me? That's the other question. Yeah.
Now we can.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This March, I introduced a bipartisan bill to incentivize states to provide compensation to elderly victims of financial fraud, abuse, and exploitation. I called it Edith's Bill after learning the story of Edith Sjogren and her family, who wrote a letter to me asking that I work on legislation to help seniors get money back when it's stolen from them, especially when it's money earned over a lifetime of hard work. General Schmidt, do you believe that elder financial fraud and abuse is underreported? And are you aware of any national programs or efforts that would incentivize states to provide compensation or restitution to these victims if they're unable to recover restitution from the offenders themselves?
Sorry, Senator, I absolutely believe that elder fraud and abuse, including financial abuse, are underreported. All of the data I've ever reviewed, and it's been substantial, suggests that there's a quarrel about how much, to what order of magnitude the underreporting is, but not about the principle. In terms of your question about compensation, I'm not aware, if it exists, I'm not aware of it, of any program that provides compensation to elder victims of crime. There is, of course, the Crime Victims Compensation Program generally that I'm sure all of our states participate in. Generally speaking, that compensation, as I recall, is limited to certain categories of costs that generally are associated with violent crime as opposed to financial losses. We make a priority in Kansas in our enforcement actions to put restitution first and the state's recovery always second. And of course, that usually is more important at the collection stage than it is at the liability imposition stage. But in principle, I don't know any particular proposals, but in principle, I think it would be a very good conversation to talk about whether there's some type of compensation program that would assist somebody who's lost a life savings as the result of fraud and scams.
So thank you for that. Edith and her family were scammed out of more than $80,000 by their longtime financial advisor. And of course, they feared that they'll never get that money back that was stolen from them. But Edith's family was able to uncover the fraud because Edith asked for help. And her son-in-law recognized that there was a problem when he was attempting to reconcile and balance her checkbook. General Schmidt, in April, you led a letter to Senate leadership in which you and other attorneys general noted that emergencies and disaster situations invite abuse and exploitation of vulnerable and isolated populations. So I want to know if you are concerned that seniors who are isolated from family members, loved ones, caregivers during the pandemic and the support networks that they usually rely on are being targeted by scammers. And how does this separation from typical caregivers make seniors more vulnerable and susceptible to such scams?
Senator, this is one of the things that keeps me up at night right now. We have focused tremendously at both the Kansas Attorney General's office and then a couple of years ago when I was president of our National Association of State Attorneys General, we focused on elder abuse issues, including financial abuse on a national basis from the state standpoint. So it's a long-standing priority for us. I am very worried that seniors who may be physically isolated ordinarily and have their contact come to them, or in terms of home health care or other home support, or who go to contact but in very discreet manners. They go to a doctor's office visit, they perhaps go to their coffee klatch for lunch on every Thursday and back, that they're now separated from those de facto early warning systems that can spot something out of the ordinary and perhaps sound the alarm, as happened with your constituents. I am very worried about that. And I might just say, I don't mean to sound like a broken record. I highlighted it in my testimony and mentioned it in my opening statement, but I really do believe that one step that Congress could take swiftly, I believe without controversy, would be to include in some vehicle this year, perhaps the next COVID bill, whatever is appropriate, the text of Senate Bill 2379, which is the latest incarnation of legislation that we've been working on now for several years. From a state standpoint, we began the advocacy. It was actually at that time Attorney General Jepsen from Connecticut and myself, bipartisan, asking for this change in statute so that we can use our existing, already funded, already trained, already skilled resources in our Medicaid fraud control units outside the exit doors of the nursing homes and long-term care facilities and reach exactly the type of isolated individuals in the Medicaid program that you're talking about. So thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, I think my time has run out, so I yield back.
Thank you very much. Senator Sinema has joined us as well. Senator Sinema.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses today. Scammers are using this pandemic as an opportunity to defraud Americans, including our seniors. Arizonans have reported thousands of COVID-related scams to the FTC, with $1.5 million in losses for Arizona families so far. And those are just the scams that are reported to the FTC. We know the actual damage is far greater. Scams aren't just a financial concern. COVID scams also endanger the health of the public, who can be defrauded into believing that certain products can prevent or cure COVID, when of course there's no scientific basis to support these claims. Scammers have also distributed counterfeit personal protective equipment, which can endanger the lives of our medical professionals and first responders. I'll continue to work with partners on the federal, state, and local levels to ensure we have adequate resources to prevent scams before they happen, ensure that we're returning funds to Arizona fraud victims, and punishing the scammers who are stealing from our families. Before I move to questions, I want to thank Senator Capito for mentioning our bill to expand FTC authority to stop false advertising during this pandemic. Our bill increases civil and criminal penalties on scammers, and we hope to find some bipartisan support for this legislation. My first question is for Attorney General Schmidt. Due to the coronavirus pandemic, scammers are using fear and confusion to steal money and personal information. Recently, I teamed up with our Attorney General, Arizona Attorney General Mark Brnovich, to warn Arizonans about some common coronavirus scams. This includes trying to sell fake coronavirus vaccines or unproven treatments to scared families and individuals. Scammers are also calling seniors and threatening to cut off stimulus payments or food assistance if they don't share personal information. You know, this criminal behavior not only hurts the direct victims, but it also hurts legitimate charitable initiatives who are trying to help vulnerable communities respond to the virus. My question for you, Attorney General, is how can policymakers help our constituents distinguish between scams and legitimate offers of assistance? And are there additional resources that states need in order to more effectively fight these new pandemic-related scams?
So, Senator, it is such a difficult question because mixed messaging is the bane of effective messaging. And we normally all are on the page of don't answer the phone, don't respond to the inquiry, just hang up on the bad guys if you don't know them. Now we're in a position we're saying, well, that's all true, but you know, we'd sure like you to respond, for example, to contact tracers when they engage with you. And that creates a really difficult message to convey to vulnerable populations. I don't know that I have a great answer. I can tell you what my messaging is when I talk with Kansans about the types of things you're saying. I usually say it boils down for me to two simple points. How do you separate the legit from the illegit? Number one, if you didn't initiate, you as the Kansan, you as the Arizona, and you as the consumer, if you didn't initiate the contact, the communication, then just assume it's not legit. Now that gets me in trouble with some legitimate, both businesses and public sector folks. But from a consumer protection standpoint, it is a simple, straightforward message. If you want a widget and you think you need a widget, sit at your breakfast table, figure that out, initiate the contact with the seller of widgets, and now you know at least you're in contact with a legitimate operator. So that's point one. And point number two, the old-fashioned advice is still good. Do business, whether it's online, remotely, or in person, do business with people you already know and trust. So shop local or shop reputable retailers in the retail space. Again, it's not perfect, but those two principles are usually what I tell folks.
Thank you, Attorney General. I appreciate that. My next question is for Mr. Smith. As part of the fight against the coronavirus, many organizations have experienced severe shortages of PPE, cleaning and disinfectant supplies, and other necessary items that would help them reopen safely and smartly. As the virus continues to surge in places like Arizona, our local businesses, schools, nursing homes, and healthcare facilities are continuing to struggle to buy supplies from their usual and trusted vendors. What advice do you have for businesses and organizations that want to buy PPE or other coronavirus-related supplies in order to avoid fraudulent or counterfeit materials?
Well, our efforts with respect to PPE have largely been focused on what I'll call shop-at-home scams or fulfillment scams, where company is offering to sell PPE and you order the PPE, it says, next day delivery, and it's not delivered next day. In fact, it's delivered never. So the folks who we're protecting are generally consumers and not businesses. And we've brought at least one enforcement action in that area, and we have several more in the pipeline. I would say that, what we are enforcing there is our mail and telephone order rule, which requires that if you're not going to deliver on time, that you provide a notice or the opportunity for a full refund. With respect to those larger institutional purchases of PPE that you're talking about, we also have been working with the Department of Justice, which has been extraordinarily active under the Defense Production Act. And a lot of our PPE fulfillment issues have followed on their price gouging under the DPA. So there are unscrupulous sellers out there selling counterfeit products, price gouging, taking advantage of institutions' needs for these products in this time of emergency. And so a lot of that, I think, is being addressed by the criminal authorities, and in particular, the Department of Justice and the Department of Justice DPA Price Gouging Task Force.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, my time's expired, but I want to thank you for holding this important hearing. I appreciate it.
Senator Sinema, thank you. Senator Blackburn has joined us as well. Senator Blackburn?
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to go to the issue of data privacy. And General Schmidt, you mentioned this in your statement. And let's look at the issue of protecting that private information. And then if that falls into the hands of scammers, what are you doing to make certain that people are not being scammed based on their information for this contact tracing? Because what we've learned, when you look at the virtual space, whoever has that data and claims possession of that data feel that they know that they own the virtual you. They have access to this, and then begin to use that entree to follow you and to share your information with outsiders and third parties. So General Schmidt, let's talk with you, or start with you, and then just if each of you will add, I want to hear about what is being done to protect privacy, to protect that data, to protect the follow-on information via contact tracing.
Senator, I appreciate the question. I don't mean to sound glib either to you or anyone who's listening, but often in this space, I think of the old expression that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And I worry in the contact tracing space because we have grown so rapidly into that data collection that perhaps we have not put in place the ordinary safeguards we would otherwise put in place with any entity, government or business, that's collecting large amounts of personal data. And we've done it for good purposes to try to properly contain the spread of the virus. But I've been sort of the contrary voice on that, and I've done it deliberately because I think we need to have a more balanced conversation. As I suggested earlier, and I won't repeat myself, but we did in Kansas, our legislature in June enacted what I've characterized as a stopgap Contact Tracing Privacy Act data privacy measure. It's designed to put in place guardrails, rules of the road, duties of privacy, limitations on distribution, and the like for all of that data that's collected, both the digital stuff that we're talking about in terms of app development here, but also data that's collected the old-fashioned way. Still, once it's collected in the database, it does have value to some folks. And so we have tried to put in those limitations to make sure that Kansans' data is protected and they can feel free to participate openly in legitimate tracing efforts.
Let me ask you this. First of all, what I've heard you say is we need to have a federal preemption and one federal standard for the retention, collection of, and retention of this data. Is that correct?
Senator, yes, with an important caveat, and that is this, and this is my state role coming out. I do understand the importance of a federal standard that makes sense, data crosses state lines. I understand that. But I would suggest that we don't want complete federal preemption of state enforcement. Correct. And we also don't want to, yes, but we also don't want to compel state, for example, state AGs to go to federal court, follow federal rules to enforce a federal law. Because with all respect, as I've said to my colleagues many times, if I wanted to do that, I'd try to go be a U.S. attorney. I'm a state actor. So it's always seemed to me what makes the most sense is to set a federal standard with respect to data privacy, but to allow states to independently enforce that standard under state law in state court with state procedures and state rules, as long as we're holding folks to the same standard.
Yeah, let me ask you this before we move on. My time is about to run out. Should then we see that, should it be that consumers, the online consumer, has the ability to choose to opt in to share their information, or choose to opt out if they do not want that entity that is collecting and holding that information to share that with third parties? Is that something that should be granted to them, or a protection afforded to them?
Well, it does seem so to me, Senator, and obviously, as you know probably better than I, that's at the core of a very broad and robust policy debate, both here and with our friends in Europe. But I am on the general side of the debate that suggests my personal data is my personal data, and I ought to be able to control with whom it is shared and then reshared and reused.
All right. I tell you what, Mr. Chairman, with that, I'm going to yield back in the interest of time. Thank you.
Thank you for yielding back. I've got to go vote. I have one question I want to ask, and then I'm going to turn the hearing over to Senator Blumenthal for a question or two he may have. He's going to then close the hearing. We are to be exiting this room by 5:45, so our panel witnesses should breathe a sigh of relief that it can't last much longer. I want to ask Mr. Sharman, with the noteworthy cybersecurity news related to Twitter last week serving as a pretty significant example of social engineering, these types of attacks continue to evolve while posing increasing harm to Americans. Your testimony indicated that these types of threats are responsible for, quote, upwards to 93% of data breaches. Do you have any recommendations for this subcommittee on how Congress can draw increased consumer attention to these risks, or even prevent them from occurring in the first place?
Yes, there is, ideally, there should be federal/national cybersecurity standards. There are several standards. For instance, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, they are abbreviated as NIST. They have several standards in place. The problem is that if you want to really combat social engineering attacks, you're going to have to go far and wide, and you're going to have to get the private sector to some degree involved and motivated to live up to data security and privacy standards. If you would ask me what is the best framework to use in this particular case, I point to the Department of Defense, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. This is abbreviated as CMMC. They have a very good model where you have 5 levels of ramp up, in the sense of making sure that you comply more over time and can build up your resilience against scams like this. And basically the ultimate or very effective solution for all the scams that you see is awareness. Train the elderly in increased awareness, and the AARP is actually doing a good job at that. It's an awareness issue, educate, but also protect. And the standards of protecting just the home PC, but also corporate networks, should ideally be a federal standard so that everyone can comply, because at the moment it's a patchwork, and as we can see, it isn't working.
Mr. Sharman, thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists for your presentation today. General Schmidt, thank you for joining us from home. Derek, I've known you at least since you were a young Cassabaum Senate staffer, and thank you for your public service now for a long period of time on behalf of our fellow Kansans. I appreciate your presence with us today, but appreciate your presence in Kansas and what you do for all of us. I now recognize Senator Blumenthal.
I want to join in thanking you as a former fellow Attorney General, and just say the next time we have a hearing with you as a witness, maybe we can do it out in Kansas instead of here. And I want to ask you specifically because Mr. Smith has said he would welcome a price gouging law at the federal level, and I completely agree, because right now there really is no federal price gouging law, and that is a great obstacle to effective federal enforcement. And I encountered this issue when I was State Attorney General, urging the then Attorneys General of the United States to take action, and the FTC, and they said to me, well, we have no federal law. And in Kansas, you have a price gouging law that says that a price increase is presumed unjustified if it exceeds by 25% the pre-crisis level. Tell me how you feel about that law, whether you think it has helped or harmed your office's ability to bring enforcement action, and whether you would recommend it to us in the United States Senate and the Congress.
Senator, I think it has been useful for Kansas. As Mr. Smith has suggested a couple of times, sure, we could, prior to enactment of that law, we could try to use our general Kansas version of the UDAP authority. We actually don't have an unfair standard, but we have a deceptive or unconscionable standard to deal with price gouging. But it is really clunky to do that, and it's much better if there's something that looks more like a bright line standard. That way everybody knows what the rules are. And our experience has been, by having that on the books with that 25% presumption, it has allowed us to get voluntary compliance almost universally, at least from legitimate actors. Now, the crooks and scammers are crooks and scammers. That's a different category. But of course, when you're talking about price regulation, you're talking about, at least to some extent, dealing with very legitimate enterprises. And the bright line rule in law is very helpful in bringing them into compliance without the need for formal enforcement. At least it has been for us.
Clarity is always good for enforcement. Let me ask you, and this is a little bit of an unfair question because Senator Moran is not here. If we were to adopt a federal statute, I personally would be against making it preemptive of all state laws, broadly preemptive. I don't know how you feel about that issue of preemption when it comes to either price gouging or other federal statutes.
Yeah, Senator, philosophically, as I suggested early on, I'm a states guy, and so not surprisingly, I'm not a fan of federal preemption generally as a philosophical matter. Now, having said that, I recognize there are times it makes perfect sense, as I just suggested to Senator Blackburn. Data privacy, I understand why you can't have, in practical matter, 50 plus with territories, different sets of standards for folks to manage data privacy. So the one thing I say on that, and I'm quick to say, and this is always true, but it's particularly true in this area. I speak only for myself. I have colleagues among the state and territory attorney general community who have very different views on this. But speaking for myself, when Congress has made the determination appropriately by subject matter for a federal standard, in some area, let's say data privacy, or maybe it's on price gouging, whatever it is, as a general matter, if that's going to be what Congress does and it's going to preempt states from having a different standard, my own preference would be don't go further than that in the preemption. Don't preempt me from having a state law that codifies in state law the same standard, so it's the same performance that's required of the regulated entity, that I can then enforce independently under state rules in state court with our state procedures, because that's what my team is accustomed to doing. And perhaps in some larger states where they have very large, let's say, consumer protection shops, they have folks who are accustomed every day to going down and litigating in federal court and enforcing federal law. Maybe it's a HIPAA statute or whatever it may be. But that's not true for us, and I think it's not true for a lot of smaller states. And so as I'm making enforcement decisions, just to be, blunter than I should, but just to make the point, I'll overstate it. I mean, I got enough to do enforcing the laws of the state of Kansas that I was hired by my voters to enforce. Enforcing federal law is not a great privilege that I aspire to. It's something else to do. It's not very high on the pecking order. So I would much rather, if Congress is going to set a standard, set it, but then let me work with my legislature, perhaps in addition to letting me go to federal court. I have no objection to that, but don't make it my exclusive option. Let me work with my legislature to find a way that we can bring state law alongside and enforce that standard our way.
Thank you. I appreciate your perspective, which I think is very valuable. On this topic of privacy, I want to ask you, Mr. Smith, contact tracing apps are not regulated under HIPAA or any other privacy laws. I've introduced bicameral legislation to regulate these apps. The proposal is called the Public Health Emergency Privacy Act. But isn't there more that the FTC could do? I know you've issued general guidance, but nothing recent and nothing specific, so far as I'm aware, such as advisory notices to the tech companies.
Right.
To the tech companies that I'm aware of about consumer privacy of contact tracing apps. If this system of contact tracing is going to have any chance of working, privacy has to be assured to consumers. That's the FTC's job. And I'm concerned that the FTC has been silent.
So the privacy of contact tracing apps we would address now in the absence of any special federal legislation using our Unfairness and Deception Authority. And I can't comment on any specific companies or any specific investigations, whether we might have them open or not. But this is an area where we have been heavily focused. And part of that is because consumers, you're right, consumers have to trust these contact tracing apps if they're going to work. We need a lot of uptake in order for contact tracing apps to work. App developers also need to know the rules of the road. So we have recently, I'd say within the last month, issued business guidance to app developers where we have 5 or 6 specific points that they should take into account when developing apps. Now, some of these aren't going to be anything new to you, like privacy by design, for example. But there is one that's kind of interesting, which is use privacy protective design features such as decentralized protocols. So one of the things that I think is really interesting about these contact tracing apps that we've been running into recently is that they don't actually collect everybody's location in one big centralized database and everybody's health information in one big centralized database. It lives here. And it is, and I have my Bluetooth turned on, and you have your Bluetooth turned on, and it has these devices all have a single Bluetooth identifier. And if I test positive for coronavirus, then that gets uploaded to the database, and you dial into the database, and you see, is anyone in any of these Bluetooth IDs that I've been in close proximity with, is it in the database or not? So by using those kinds of decentralized protocols, we solve a lot of privacy issues up front. Other guidance, which again, no surprise, don't use identifiable data, use aggregated data to the extent you're able. Some of these apps will do things like display heat maps for where there's particular risk of exposure. So that you don't need to know, you don't need to have even unique personal data, much less personally identifiable data. Aggregated data will do just fine. So we have, within the last month or so, I think, issued business guidance for app developers. But you're right that this is an area where we need to be vigilant, and we are heavily focused on it because this is the privacy issue for 2020.
It is one of the key privacy issues, and it has such sweeping ramifications, as you know as well or better than I. And I'm just thinking that more clarity and specificity with more information made available to the public. I'm aware of those protocols, the decentralization, use of Bluetooth. Amazon and Google are working on systems. There is a coalition of groups that's hoping, I think, to have it ready by the end of the summer. But I think an explanation to the American public about how this data is safe, what those rules of the road will be, and how they will be impervious or at least highly protected against intrusion or interference, I think it would be very valuable
That's
to
an
make these
excellent
systems
point.
work.
Our consumer ed so far has focused more on how to spot a contact tracing scam, right? Which is the don't click on a link. If they ask you for money, it's not legitimate, that kind of stuff. But you're right, in order to build trust, we might need to have to, actually explain, look, this is what a contact tracing app does and how it works.
Because as you know, as you well know, contact tracing doesn't work unless you reach a threshold level of participation. Right. And right now, we ain't nowhere near
right.
anywhere in this whole country, and very few places in the world, if any, have reached that threshold level. So, we talk so broadly and frequently about we need testing, we need contact tracing, we need a vaccine, we need therapeutics, and in some ways, the contact tracing may be the most difficult of all to achieve because we don't have that trust and credibility.
Right, and I don't know, so I'm not sort of up to date as of today, but I do not believe that there are very many state boards of health that have contact tracing apps. And I think that, Kansas has passed its contact tracing law, but I have heard only of one or two states that have developed these apps. And then, of course, the apps are going to have to be able to work together, right? Virginia will have to speak with Oklahoma, and the different APIs, whether it be Google or Apple, will have to work together. So it's a significant challenge.
Right. Well, we could talk about a lot more. I have one more area of questioning that I want to cover. You mentioned that the warning letters are, I think you said effective, maybe even very effective. Maybe in some cases, but I talked about 255 warning letters. A lot of those scammers have come back, maybe not with exactly the same language, but they're back. And in some part, due to the lack of vigilance on the part of the tech platforms that I mentioned earlier, and Ms. McClary very articulately described, need to be held more accountable. But I just want to say about warning letters, speaking as a prosecutor, I used to try to get actual court judgments, not even consent orders, because you get a consent order, you have to go back to court to enforce it. With a warning letter, you have nothing to enforce. It's no deterrent. If you leave here and you drive above the speed limit, 85 miles an hour in a 60 mile an hour zone, and you get a warning letter, the deterrent effect, especially if you know that the next time you get another warning letter, has very little impact. So I wonder whether a more aggressive use of whether it's administrative or actual judicial process for judgments, for fines, for even criminal referrals wouldn't be appropriate.
Right. So, well, there's a lot there. And I agree with you 100% that a warning letter by definition is a warning letter. There is nothing to enforce. But in the last, let's say we've been at this for 3.5 months, middle of March, maybe 4 months. And in that time, we have succeeded in getting almost all of those 255 companies to take down the claims. And for those that haven't, there are some, and there are some that have taken the claims down only to replace it with something that's equally misleading. We are pursuing law enforcement action, both in federal court and in front of our administrative law judges. You've seen the fruits of some of that, and it's outlined in our testimony. There's a lot more of that in the pipeline, though. But those cases take time. And particularly when you're talking about fake cures, the way that we will typically prove that up is with expert testimony to say, here's what scientific, educated people in the profession would say is adequate substantiation, and you ain't got it. That takes time. It also takes money, but I think we have the resources. I think we have the manpower to do it. We are doing it, but it's not something that can be easily done overnight. And so, these warning letters have been very fast and very effective, I think. And when not, then we back it up with law enforcement. But you're absolutely right that a warning letter on its face is not worth much. Now, General Schmidt, though, said that with respect to price gouging, that a lot of the challenge is just telling companies that are legitimate, more or less, that, hey, look, you can't do this. You can't say this. And when you do that, if we can fix the problem through that kind of communication, then we need to be doing that. But I appreciate your concern. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think there are all kinds of different potential violations. Some are close to the line, some are in the gray area. When you recommend the equivalent of somebody swallowing